The woman looked at the man with the stick walking toward her. She thought about how she had never loved him. Looking at her, he asked what was wrong and whether he seemed more ugly up close. Catching her by the hand, the man asked if that was why she had cheated on him, because the Baron was very handsome. He also asked if the snake had promised her eternal love. With tears in her eyes, the woman shouted that he could think what he wanted and that she did not care. With his eyes bulging with anger, he told her to think what she wanted. But he was still her husband. She looked up at him, questioning him in surprise. And then she asked him if he really thought he had the right to call himself that, because he had never acted like her husband. He stared even more when he heard that their marriage was over. The man squeezed the woman's hand harder, asking her if she really loved him, but then said when she did not answer that she had nowhere to go from him. When the girl tried to pull her hand away, he grabbed it harder, saying that she would not go anywhere, even if this house fell apart, because she belonged to him. But she only asked why he was doing this. Turning around, she walked away as she tore out her arm and said that she would not stay in this house anymore and that she would not live here like a ghost for the rest of her life. She ran down the stairs, saying that he would not make her stay, and pondered the question of love he had asked. If only she had loved, but it was only revenge on him, Ian Nottingham. The next moment, she was lying on the floor in a pool of her own blood. She cried, thinking that she had endured so much, but would remain an unfaithful wife. The last thing she saw was the Earl of Nottingham sobbing desperately on his knees on the floor. Finally she smiled, thinking that this would be fine with her too, if he felt desperate for even a second. The girl sat in front of the mirror and thought she was ready to meet Hades, but she was far from the afterlife and was now being combed by a maid at the Roanfield estate and was 17 again. The maid asked her while she was reading the newspaper if she was doing well. She told her not to pretend, because she had been sick recently, and that they were worried that it was not some kind of serious illness. She looked at the newspaper, hearing the maid ask if she was really doing well, because she had never read a newspaper before, and she was looking at the year, 1914, the year her misfortunes began. She recalled that when her mother died, she and her father lived well and even happily. The self who loved her, dresses back then, and that was her only problem. When they lost their fortune due to a business failure, she found her father hanging in his office, standing in the doorway. The girl recalled that she had found her father's will on the floor, but it did not say a word about his own daughter, so she had to do something, so she married a count she had never seen. As she held out her bloody hand, she thought that both of them had dragged each other into the abyss of despair and that their marriage had ended so tragically. As she went for a walk, she thought that if she was 17 again, they would soon lose their fortune. But if she convinced her father not to invest there, she could change the future. She thought that her father was on a world tour and didn't save money, but the fact that he didn't mention her in his will was strange. Madeline looked up in surprise when she heard her father calling her name. He looked out of the carriage, saying that he was glad his daughter had come out to meet him. As she got into the carriage, she thought that she owed her good life to her father, but that she had to avoid meeting Ian Nottingham by all means. She looked at the man looking out the window, turning away when her father said he wanted to introduce her to someone. After her father introduced her husband as Ian Nottingham, a healthy and handsome man returned to her, not the way she remembered him. The girl sat there like a drowned person as her father pontificated before the count and talked about his busy schedule. Nottingham said it was not difficult for him, although he did not seem very happy about this invitation and visit. While the girl was thinking that the last time he was in London at this time, the count said with a smile that he had heard that her father's latest investment had been very successful. She couldn't believe that this man in front of her was Ian Nottingham, because she had never seen him like this before. Madeline remembered what he was like in her past life. He was a shouting tyrant, and not even remotely like the man sitting across from her. The girl recalled that when she touched him, he fell to his knee, and servants ran to help him. Madeline looked down and thought that the man she was looking at now was far from the man she had known in the past, and she didn't know how to feel about it. While she was thinking about her own, her father asked the count about horse racing, and the latter said that he loved equestrian sports, which made the man very happy. The girl kept thinking that this guy loved horse racing, didn't limp, and didn't raise his voice at her. In her past life, she was sitting in a wedding dress with a bouquet of flowers and did not look very happy at her own wedding. The butler asked her if she was nervous, and she replied unenthusiastically that she was a little bit. The man said that his illumination was a good person and told her not to be afraid. But Madeline said she wasn't afraid. but was only thinking about whether she could be a good wife. Recalling that evening, as she sat on her bed and looked out the window, she thought that although she did not love the Count, she wanted to have a good marriage and be a beacon for her wounded husband. She lay there until the morning of their wedding night, and he never came, shattering her dreams of a perfect marriage. She recalled how a maid used to keep her company, and the Count did not want to spend a second with her. This time she was sitting in the garden. In the evening she stood next to the Earl of Nottingham, saying that he seemed to have forgotten about her existence. He didn't even look up from the papers he was looking at, saying that this was not true at all. Madeline frowned at her husband and said that she was bored alone. The next morning, she saw a puppy, which she was told was a gift from his illumination. The butler was holding a puppy on a leash, which was shivering as he sat next to him. Sitting down opposite the puppy, the girl looked at it and wondered if the Count was really giving her a dog to keep her from getting bored. When the puppy licked her hand, she scooped it up in her arms and held it close. She shed a tear because the puppy was as scared as she was. When they arrived, my father talked about their estate, saying that few people in their country build in the Renaissance style, while Ian looked at the house. Her father asked if Madeline would like to show the Count around the estate while they prepared the meal, but she slouched and said she wasn't feeling well. When her father asked her to play the piano, the Earl of Nottingham stared at her unblinkingly. When the father started to protest because the girl had told him how she was feeling, Ian stuck out his hand and said he didn't mind. Putting his hand to his heart and bowing, the Count said he was very pleased to meet him. Madeline bowed her head, saying that she was sorry for not being able to play. She thought that she was looking at Ian, who had not yet been broken by misfortune, and seeing him like that, she thought that she should not interfere in his life at all. As she turned around under her father's gaze, she thought that they didn't need to get closer for their mutual good. The girl looked at the documents, thinking that before the war started, they had to sell the estate and land. If they save money and move to the village, they will survive. She thought she had to make her father throw money and play, but she was distracted by a knock on the door that made her turn her head. It was my dad who came into the room and asked if he could come in. She turned happily to the door, saying that she was going to go to her dad on her own soon. He put a stamped envelope on the table, saying it was an invitation to London for her.
With a sweet smile, my father told me that now was the time to make my debut in high society.
Thinking that this was not the time for balls, she asked out loud if she really had to make her debut, exhaling loudly. She even asked again, stopping the cup halfway to her mouth when her father asked if she was unhappy. And then she continued to drink her tea calmly, as her father told her that she reads a lot of books, constantly tells him to spend less money, and now she doesn't want to get married at all. My father started shouting that refusing to debut was like refusing to get married, especially since he had even bought them a townhouse in London to make it more convenient. When she said that the house should be sold, he shouted at his daughter not to talk nonsense. She also reminded him not to forget about his investment in the wine business, which made him stutter and ask how she knew about it. To her surprise, he jumped off the couch and shouted, asking if she had read his letters and saying that it was very low of her. When she heard that it was not the girl's idea, she just looked at her father coldly. Madeline threw away the invitation her father had given her, saying that if he didn't listen to her, she wouldn't even look toward high society and wouldn't get married. With a sweet smile, she added that if he persisted, she would take up the profession of nun without a pang of conscience. My father was shaking with anger, which was written all over his face when he heard this. He said she was not allowed to leave the room until she apologized. After a while, there was a ball in London. Everyone was dancing and having fun, while somewhere in the background of the merriment, Madeline asked her father if he had really burned the contract. While her father said yes, because she had been on his mind all this time, she asked if he had any more copies. After assuring her that he did not, he asked her to finally dance with someone. The girl said that she was not sure if she wanted to do this yet, and she did not look very happy. Madeline listened to the story that she, as the heiress of the family, had a duty to marry well. She exhaled, thinking bleakly that this ball season would not end anyway, because the war would begin. Imagining herself as a doll being pulled by strings, she told herself that she didn't want to play the role of this doll anymore. Looking somewhere above all the fun, she thought that all she had to do was to save her family from collapse. She smiled, thinking that she could continue learning to play the piano, and then she could find a job. But Nottingham appeared next to her, holding a glass of wine in his hand and saying that she seemed to be someone who didn't like balls and receptions very much. The girl looked at him in surprise, unable to believe that it was Ian Nottingham in person. Turning her head sharply to avoid looking at him, she said that it was not. But she asked if he thought it was strange. But the man said that he didn't see anything strange because everyone was just having a good time. Madeline said seriously that she was angry because they were having fun until they knew what the future held. And the Count laughed, saying that there was some truth in her words. But he said that no one knows their future, so everyone is having fun and seizing the moment. And he suggested that the girl relax. The girl frowned a little when the Count said that sometimes people need to relax, which is what people do. She said that she doesn't tell others not to do it, but for her, all these holidays are a waste of time and she doesn't like it. But he asked her with a smile if she wanted to dance with him, which caught the girl's attention. To her surprise, he bowed with his hand on her chest and asked if she would give him a dance. The girl looked at him and thought that she had no obligation to save anyone, especially Ian. She thought she should use her second chance at life to escape him. Looking at him smiling, Madeline thought that if she did nothing now, he would go to war and return traumatized. He would arrive crippled not only in body but also in mind, so she had to push him in the right direction. She could then give him advice to help him. One of the guests of the ball turned around and pointed to a girl, and the other asked which one he should look at, because there were many of them. But the first one said that he was counting how many men the lady had already rejected. Looking at Madeline, the guy with the cigar said that she had dumped 6 guys. She had just made her debut and wasn't as desperate as the others, but she wasn't exactly good. But the Earl of Nottingham looked in surprise at the girl the boy was pointing to, because it was Roanfield's daughter. The third guy asked if he could approach her, but the first guy said that he didn't even know her, so it would be very rude. But the boy screamed at the back of the Earl of Nottingham when he shoved the boy away and went to the girl. The guy with the cigar smilingly said that he didn't think he would live to see the day when Ian Nottingham would approach a lady himself. The girl stared at the dancing couple, discussing the fact that the two were already dancing the 4th dance. Another asked who she was, because she was dancing with the Count himself. The man asked if she was okay, stopping the dance. He drew attention to her hands, saying they were shaking. While everyone else was busy, the Count said that her hands were shaking, and that she was looking at him as if she were sorry. She was thinking about whether to tell him everything or let go of his hand and never regret anything. Meanwhile, another dancing couple approached them. The Count caught the girl by the arm and supported her by the waist so that she would not fall from a collision with another girl. She looked back at the falling rose and thought that if their fates were to intertwine again, she would have to go through years of loneliness. She fantasized about being older when she was 26. She was looking at a rosebush that she adored. As the dog ran around, the girl looked at the broken rose and wondered who had done it, because everyone knew how much she cared for the rose garden. The dog yapped sweetly when Madeline asked if she had done it. The girl told the dog that she hoped that the person who cut the rose received at least a little joy from the flower. It was raining heavily, but Madeline ran around looking for Corey, while servants chased after her and asked her to return to the mansion. The girl turned angrily, telling Sebastian to go back to the house he was offering her, and she would look for her dog herself. While they were arguing, and the butler was saying that he was not taking care of her for the Count's sake, Sir Nottingham himself appeared. He told his wife to return to the estate, and when she cried for the dog, he simply told her to forget about him. The Count said that it was just an animal, although his face was frozen with a mask of pity. He said that he could not allow a person to fall ill because of a dog. She screamed, asking him how he could do this, since he was the one who gave the dog and the dog was the only one in the house who cared about her. The Count came over and, putting his hands on her shoulders and squeezing them a little, called her. She was crying in the rain, looking into his eyes, when the Count ordered her to go inside. Madeline blushed when the Earl of Nottingham called her to the ball, putting his hands on her shoulders. The girl took her hand away from the man's and turned to leave, saying that she was fine. She curtsied and said she was glad to meet him and said goodbye, wishing him a good night. Looking after her, the Count spoke to himself, saying that the girl had not warmed up to him even after 4 dances. Although he was smiling, he told himself that he was disappointed. Madeline had thought that avoiding the Count in a small circle would be problematic, but now, sitting across from him at the table, she didn't think it would be so difficult. Calmly sipping from her glass, she thought that she certainly did not want to be part of a conversation in high tones. While Isabelle spoke quite loudly, Earl Nottingham asked her to lower her voice and stop shouting. The girl screamed, asking if she really shouldn't give in to emotions, because she also heard that she was being influenced by that lowlife. Madeline mentioned that in her past life, Isabelle Nottingham, Ian's sister, had died in an accident before the war, but it was rumored that it was no accident. While the guy next to her was talking, she kept thinking that Ian could be less unhappy if he had at least one living relative. In her past life, she once sat down at the piano that Lady Isabelle used to play. She was curious and wanted to play. She looked around, seeing that there was not a single gram of dust in the room, because the room was well taken care of. Madeline picked up a photograph that had fallen from somewhere and saw Lady Isabelle in it, but did not know who was next to her. On the back, she read a dedication to Zachary Myloff, whom she loved, according to the text. The girl put the photo back, but noticed something else. The music was handwritten because, apparently, Isabelle had written the melody herself. She missed Isabelle, even though she didn't know her, but wanted to get to know her. As Madeline began to play the tune on the piano, she thought that the sound of Isabelle's song was definitely breathing life into this gloomy mansion. But in the middle of the melody, the door of the room opened with a sharp bang, and the Count stood on the threshold. He was shaking with anger and ordered the girl to get out. Standing up, Madeline clenched her fist in irritation, saying that she was his wife, and if he had any respect for her, he would explain why. But he bowed his head and told her never to dare to enter this room again. Sitting at the table now, she thought he was reacting out of affection for his sister, but now they were ready to cling to each other's throats, and Isabelle kept screaming. With a sharp movement, she stood up and shouted that he was her brother, a nobody. As she was leaving, the girl said that she had too little air in his presence. Recalling how the woman looked at the time of her death, as reported in the newspapers, I realized that today was the day Isabelle Nottingham was supposed to die. The guy sitting next to me said they often fight now and did so with a smile when Madeline stood up and apologized. The boy shouted, trying to stop her, as she followed Lady Isabelle, the Count looking at her back with interest. She ran down the stairs, trying to shout to Lady Isabelle and stop her. The lady's eyes bugged out when she heard a question about her lover, because no one knew about him, and it surprised her. When Isabelle returned, she screamed, asking and accusing her of eavesdropping on her and her brother's conversation. She said that there were always unprincipled women around her brother who would do anything for his attention, so she was sure that she was listening. Madeline cried out in despair, asking if she was going to see Mr. Myloff. Turning to the stranger, she stammered and asked how she knew about him. The blonde woman told the lady not to worry, because she wouldn't tell anyone, because she didn't understand anything about socialism or whatever it was called. But Lady Isabelle could not believe it, asking if the girl was her brother's informant. Isabelle, when Madeline said that the Count was a gentleman, but stubborn, said that she wouldn't call him a gentleman, but he knew how to bend people to his will. The girl looked at the stranger with surprise and confusion and said that she must know her brother very well. Taking her barely by the hand, Madeline desperately begged her not to succumb to the Earl of Nottingham's provocations and his desire to control everything. With her eyes closed, she recalled her past life and said that she had once given in to her husband and that it had ruined her life. Thinking about the way she squeezed Isabelle's hand, she didn't worry about getting tangled up with Ian again. She just wanted to save the woman in front of her. Madeline said that there are many ways that a girl has not tried yet, so she should not go down the path of emotions. From above, someone was watching them, seeing Isabelle agreeing to something and asking the blonde to finally let go of her hand. Ian Nottingham watched this scene with interest and unwavering interest. The girls turned at the sound of footsteps, silently looking back at the Count. On the way down, he asked the girl to leave because it was between him and his sister, but Isabelle shouted, "No," and asked the blonde what her name was again. She said her name was Madeline Roanfield, and then immediately Isabelle shouted that she would stay with Ms. Roanfield. The Count was puzzled because Isabelle had told him to stay out of their business and that they were just talking. The blonde asked if the girl could let go of her hand, but Isabelle asked in response who was the first to start grabbing hands, hinting at her. Ian said that meddling in other people's families was not the best thing to do, referring to Ms. Roanfield, and told his sister that every action has consequences and that she should remember that. Both girls looked at the Count in surprise, and Isabelle's expression showed that she was getting angry. Closing her eyes, the girl thought she knew it, because he didn't even thank her for calming his sister down. In the morning, reading the newspaper, Madeline thought that everyone was writing about Isabelle that morning, but today the topics were different, so she concluded that Lady Nottingham was safe. She could not hold back her smile, thanking God that she was healthy and alive. She thought that there was probably no one to stop her last time, and that it was probably the last time the brother and sister would ever interact. Closing her eyes and throwing her head back, the girl recalled that after the incident in Isabelle's room, he had given the girl his own piano. And remembering his behavior then, she thought that Ian might have been apologizing in that way. Now, looking at the invitation, she thought that the next evening would be at the Colhat estate. Looking at the people, she noticed that Ian wasn't present today, so she thought she could make some new friends today and relax. Immediately after this thought, a guy appeared, stuck out his hand with a smile, and asked if she was Miss Madeline Roanfield, which surprised the girl. Holding the boy's hand, she listened to him say that the reception was arranged just to accompany her. But the girl remembered that in his past life, he had broken many hearts. They stopped, looking at those gathered in the mansion, and the boy asked her if she was hungry because they had just had tea before dinner. They sat down in chairs, and the guy started asking if she had ever been to Vienna and said that she would definitely like it there because it was a modern and developed city. As he handed the girl a glass of champagne, the guy said that his days in Vienna reminded him that humanity will always progress. Saying only what she understood, the girl thought that, unfortunately, the war would level this city to the ground. The girl was surprised to see someone interrupt their conversation, saying that he was not sure about Vienna and taking her champagne glass. It was Ian Nottingham, and behind him were his brother and sister. People started watching, and the guy even said that apparently George was in the same class as Ian Nottingham. Madeline looked at Ian, seeing now that he was not alone, with Isabelle and his brother Eric. He was just sitting down next to George, greeting him and saying that it had been a long time. They were obviously happy to see each other. Lady Isabelle sat opposite and looked warily at the girl in front of her. At the same time, George asked if they disagreed with the theory, but Eric said he was not sure that people would continue to make peaceful progress. Ian added thoughtfully that humans are built to compete and will always choose to compete. Ironically, he said, that's why they have made such progress. But while Madeline listened to Ian's correct theories with regret, Isabelle got up from her seat and got ready to go out. But George said that war is impossible now because the world is more economically united than ever. But the Count said with a smile that he disagreed, because if the need arose, a new military conflict would be unleashed. Turning back to the girl, Ian noticed her looking at him with a smile and, to her surprise, asked her what she thought about it. She said that military power was part of progress, but she wondered if they could justify millions of lives lost for the sake of such progress. She was clutching her dress from the memories of the past. Ian listened with interest that she believed he was right in his thoughts, but there were some things where she disagreed. Looking at him seriously and unflinchingly, Madeline said that wars are started by people who believe in a necessary evil. With a smile, after a short pause, the man said that this was Lady Roanfield's opinion on war and progress. Now everyone was looking at her, leaving their conversations behind, and the girl wondered if she had been too outspoken when she had expressed her opinion. Eric saved the day by saying he couldn't keep up with the political talk and asked if anyone was going to Wimbledon this year, and George asked if they still played tennis. And my brother started praising Ian, saying he was a great player. This conversation made the girl breathe a sigh of relief, because everyone had already forgotten what she had said. While all the boys were talking about tennis and the rivalry on the court, Ian noticed that Madeline had quietly left the room, so he kept his eyes on her moving figure. Standing on the balcony and leaning on the railing, she thought that she did not want to show so openly that she disagreed with Ian's opinion and blamed herself for it. Shaking her head, she thought he didn't seem too upset about it, as far as she could see. She remembered his expression and smile that she saw then, and thought that he even liked it, just like she did. In the garden, Madeline saw Isabelle walking with her husband and laughing about something. She remembered the photo she had found in Isabelle's room in her past life, and realized that it was her beloved husband. Madeline smiled as she looked at the couple and realized that they looked so in love. Thinking that Isabelle was even ready to die for her beloved, the girl also thought that she would like to fall in love in the same way someday. Ian caught her attention and made her turn to him. He asked if he could talk to her, and she thought that if he came closer, he would see Isabelle. To his surprise, Madeline came closer herself, and he even stuttered, asking again if he could talk to her. He turned his head a little awkwardly to the side, saying that the topic of conversation would be what happened the first time they met, and she asked when exactly. He said he shouldn't have scolded her for helping his sister. The girl went the other way, saying that it was nothing, but she thought that Isabelle was about to get caught, and that she had to get Ian out of here. Standing with her back to her husband, Madeline asked him if they could go inside together. He seriously told the girl that she was embarrassing him. Ian was not going to come in and said that for some time now, she had been showing that she had no sympathy for him. With a thoughtful hand to his face, He said that everything looked as if she despised him. Extending his hand to her, the man said that he might be imagining things and hoped that her dislike would not get worse, because neither of them would benefit from it. Looking directly at her, puzzled by these words, he said that one never knows what the future holds. And then he suggested going inside because it was getting cold. But the girl said that his words sounded as if they were going to face only misfortune. Bowing in curtsy, Madeline told him to go first, as she wanted to admire the landscape a little more. He nodded, but asked more of a statement that she was unwilling to open up to him, even for a short period of time. Clenching his hand into a fist, Ian said that he respected her wishes and would leave her alone today, but he also said that he did not intend to back down. Looking at him, the girl thought how stupid they seemed to the couple in the garden, because Ian mistook obsession for love. She thought she couldn't give him hope because he was standing there as if to protect her from the wind, but in fact he was only casting his shadow over her. In her past life, she was sitting on her bed, wondering how much longer she would live like this and what would happen to Corey, her dog, when she died. Madeline cried, thinking that an even more important question for her was what would happen to her when Corey died. She wondered if she would go crazy if the dog left her alone in this God-forsaken place, and if she was forced to exist here as a ghost for the rest of her life. She jumped to her feet with a sudden movement, thinking she had a plan to avoid spending the rest of her life in this hell alone. Clutching her trembling hands, she told the dog not to worry, that he had nothing to worry about. The next morning, Ian Nottingham asked the butler what his wife had done, but more because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. After picking up Corey, she sat in the carriage looking out the window while the butler explained that she had left the estate under the cover of darkness in the morning. Madeline sat in her chair and looked at the couple in front of her, thinking that she couldn't believe she was in a London movie theater. She thought she had managed to escape from the house and wondered if there was a commotion and how Ian was doing. She wondered whether Ian was happy to be rid of her or upset. Madeline cried while watching a movie with Charlie Chaplin about a child he raised as his own son. She put her hands over her face. She returned to the room, and Corey immediately ran to her, barking, and Madeline apologized for leaving him for so long. While Corey was eating his food, the girl was thinking about how cool the movie was, and that the way the people moved on the wall was very mesmerizing. She asked the dog, while he was still eating, if he liked being free. She looked at herself in the mirror, thinking about where to buy Corey food and wash her clothes because her dress was dirty. On the other side of the door, she was informed that she had received a telegram. She was just at the door to pick it up. With trembling hands, she opened it, where she read that it was from Ian. He said he would be waiting for her at the train station. Looking at the paper, she thought she could escape if she made it all the way to London. She rolled her eyes, thinking that it wasn't true, but asked herself why it had left her heart. Now she was 17 again, sitting on a chair and watching the others dance. With her head bowed, she wondered why it was impossible to achieve anything in this world without an inheritance or marriage. The girl thought she looked more like a fool, because she had to memorize at least a dozen companies to invest in before she died. But she was surprised to feel someone touching her forehead. It was Ian Nottingham who said that she had been looking tired lately. He sat down next to her and said with a smile that maybe the London air didn't suit her, while she looked at him in surprise. When she said that she was tired because of her studies, the Count asked if she was studying ancient Greek or something similar. Recalling herself staying up late at night working on the books, Madeline joked that it was more like an ancient Greek tragedy. Ian couldn't understand, looking at the girl in puzzlement when she said that she wanted to prevent the inevitability of fate. Blushing a little, she said that she was thinking about how to provide for herself, while he leaned over, surprised even more, because noblewomen don't care much about such things, and asked if it was her father. She told him not to apologize when Ian started to apologize after the question, because her father's life was known even in London. She told him to prepare for the worst. Her husband told her that she should think more practically and find someone who would do it all for her. Madeline laughed, saying that she thought that's what most people do. With her head bowed, she said she just didn't want to depend on anyone. She asked the man if he had ever hated himself so much that he began to hate others by turning his head toward him. Ian opened his mouth in surprise, asking why he should hate himself. The girl laughed and then apologized, because it was very rude of her, but the man turned away from her and said that everything was fine. Blushing a little, she said that his attitude towards her was worthy of approval. Ian opened the door by calling her by her first name, but then corrected himself by addressing her by her surname, as was the proper etiquette. He brought the news that Mr. Roanfield had gone bankrupt. She looked at the man in front of her, feeling her life falling apart. She ran around the estate asking where her father was. The maid, who was crying, said that his illumination was in the room. As she ran up the steps, she held her dress and asked how long he had been in the room, and the maid replied that it had been about noon. She stopped, eyes bulging with fear and memories, when she heard her father say that no one was allowed in the room. She abruptly opened the door, calling for her father, while horror froze in her eyes. My father was sitting on the bed, and the butler was feeding him something. They both looked at Lady Madeline in surprise. When the maid and the butler left, her father asked her why she was so nervous and reminded her to behave like a lady. While the lady was recovering from her fear, the girl told her father to forget about why she was nervous and asked him how it happened that he went bankrupt, because he had burned everything and the contracts. My father plunged his face into his feet, saying that it was all because of him. She screamed when her father told her that he had invested all his money in a trading company that went bankrupt. Holding his daughter's hand, Mr. Rowanfield said she was his last hope. She exhaled, thinking that she should be glad that her father hadn't done anything to himself, that he was alive and that she could help him somehow. She stroked her father's hand, saying that the main thing was that he was healthy and alive, and they would overcome everything else together. When she was talking about selling the house and going to work to pay off the debt, he interrupted and told his daughter not to talk nonsense, because why should a nobleman have to work? She began to lie, saying that they had only danced twice, when her father said that there were rumors that the Earl of Nottingham had taken a liking to her and that she should start looking for a husband. Now the girl was standing at another reception, looking down at something in front of her. She was thinking about how to convince her father that marriage to a moneybag was not the key to happiness. She thought that they could sell all the houses and they would somehow survive. But how would they make a living then? Looking around at the others, she thought it wasn't the best time to go to receptions. But if her father hadn't been bedridden, things would have been different. Mr. Perel stood in front of her, asking if he remembered correctly that she was Miss Rowanfield. The girl bowed her head, and he said that he was glad that she liked his dinner party. He held out his hand to her, asking if he could ask her to dance, as she stared in surprise at the man's outstretched hand. When Madeline refused, saying she wasn't feeling well, he frowned, because he was definitely not used to being rejected. Red-faced from drinking, he said that he had heard that there had been an accident in her family, but that Mr. Rowanfield had nothing to worry about with her. The girl bowed down, while the man said that there was probably a line of men behind her and that she definitely did not need him. Thinking that it would be worse to make the family's situation worse by being rude to him, she just bowed and said that she was grateful for his advice. And then her eyes widened in surprise when she heard Ian's voice. He walked over with a glass of champagne and asked the host if he could turn on the music. He said, meanwhile, that he heard a nasty squeak in his ears, and that it was probably a drunken fool who did not know how to distinguish between cavalierness and advice. The man's eyes bulged with fear when he heard this, and he began to stutter. When the owner ran to turn on the music, the other guy told Ian that he had literally attacked the poor owner and that he shouldn't have interfered. When she heard Nottingham say that he was not the type to stand on the sidelines, she felt uncomfortable, but looked at him steadily. He frowned and asked why Ian was interested in something like that. To the Count's angry surprise, they were interrupted by Isabelle, who grabbed Miss Rowanfield's hand and told them that they should look at the new dress catalog that had just been published. As they walked further, Madeline asked about the catalog, but Isabelle asked back if that's what ladies say when they want to get off topic. She said that Ian burned her with his eyes and asked Madeline if she was a medium, if she could see the future or talk to the dead. The girl cheerfully said no, but stuttered a little in surprise. She looked at the girl in surprise when she heard her ask if she realized how mysterious she was. After all, she knew her lover's name and what she was going to do. She asked if Isabelle really wanted to kill herself, but she started screaming and said that she just wanted to go for a car ride, even though she was drunk. The girl frowned and asked if Isabelle realized how stupid this was. Isabelle, hearing that the girl didn't really want to save face when she spoke about decency, said that she was speaking like one of her friends. Madeline asked in surprise who, and Isabelle replied with a smile that it was an old friend and that she had a feeling they would become good friends as well. Still smiling, Isabelle said she had something to say because she liked Madeline. She said that her brother wanted to invite the girl to their estate. He looked back at the girls as his sister smoked, and Madeline herself reflected on how different she thought everything was in this version of her life. But fate, as she realized, still takes her back in time. When her father was unhappy that she didn't wear pink, She said she had no desire to dress brightly when they went to ask for financial assistance. The father showed her the letter, saying that it was not from the Earl of Nottingham, but from his eldest son for her. The father was visibly pleased, but he looked at his daughter, who told him not to get his hopes up. She said that the Nottinghams were an old and well-known family, and that it was unlikely that any of them would be interested in the daughter of a bankrupt baron. She bet that Ian hadn't even written that letter, but her father told her not to be so angry. With shining eyes, he said that Mr. Nottingham had sent this invitation, even though he knew about their current situation. But they had to win him over to their side to get any financial help. Madeline thought that this man definitely did not want to propose to her, but was only satisfying some moral obligation. The servants bent down politely to welcome them to the estate when Madeline and her father arrived. The girl looked at Sebastian, the butler, dumbfounded, and thought that she had been thinking so much about Ian that she hadn't thought she could meet other people. The butler asked if something was bothering her, seeing her look, and the girl stammered and replied that everything was fine. Her father stared at her in surprise. The Earl and his wife Catherine, as well as his eldest son Ian, stood on the doorstep. They welcomed Mr. and Mrs. Roanfield to their home. My father said that it was an honor to be invited to their home, and the Countess bowed, saying that she was very pleased to meet them. Bowing politely, Madeline thanked her illumination with a smile for the invitation and thought about how she had not had time to meet Ian's parents in her past life. She recalled a photo with broken glass that she had seen in the past, and recalled that the Earl had been struck down by illness and died before the war, and Lady Catherine had faded away after the deaths of her 2 children. Now she was looking at these people, who seemed much nicer and warmer than in the portrait she remembered. With a smile, Madeline watched the Count and his wife, who, despite his illness, were visibly happy. Snapping her out of her reverie, Ian held out his hand to the girl and invited her to come with him. Taking his hand, she went up the stairs and thanked him for his help. The man was smiling visibly. She could see that the estate was not the same as before. The people here were full of energy and were playing tennis when she and Ian came over and watched the game. She couldn't help but smile when she realized that everyone here was enjoying life and that Nottingham Manor was not at all like she remembered. And now she saw Ian in a new light. They looked at each other at the table, and the girl thought that if the family hadn't suffered grief before she came, it would have been completely different. She blushed, thinking that if she had been here earlier, things might have turned out differently for her and Ian. The Earl of Nottingham asked if they had enjoyed the dinner, and her father said that of course they had, because even the tea was incredibly delicious. When asked, Madeline stopped her cup halfway through with a smile and said that it was hard for her to put into words how grateful she was. She bowed her head and lowered her eyes, thinking it was too late to bring the conversation to their financial situation. The Count stood up, saying that they would not disturb the young people, and the father and Lady Catherine also rose to Madeline's complete surprise. Turning to her, her father whispered to her that she should be obedient and not throw away any grasshoppers. Ian told her not to get up and that he would get up himself. It didn't sound good, but he didn't give her time to think about it. And then he surprised her even more when he got down on one knee in front of her and looked down at her. The girl could not believe what was happening, her eyes bulging and her eyebrows furrowed. Visibly nervous and blushing, the man asked if she would marry him. She asked him why, but he said he understood that he had taken her by surprise. He said that he had heard rumors about her family's bankruptcy, and the girl turned away in irritation, asking how this was related to the proposal. Frowning a little, Ian said that he could give her what she needed and that he had already discussed it with her parents, so her participation was not necessary. And then he took out a beautiful ring and, opening the box, told Miss Roanfield that he was proposing to her. Madeline was visibly unhappy when she heard that Ian wanted his father, who has noticeable health problems, to see his wedding. The girl, clenching her fists, asked if he loved her, watching the man steadily. Getting up from his knees, he came closer and said that he wouldn't call his feelings for her so short-lived. This made her listen more carefully. He said that what he felt could be called sympathy and similarity of views because she had interesting views and seemed more reasonable even than her father, although he apologized for the latter. He recalled her saying that she wanted to live independently and not depend on anyone, and that he would be the best partner in such a relationship. Looking her in the eye, the boy said that he wanted the lady of his heart to be sensible, not naive like the girls from other estates. Shaking her head, she told herself under her breath that he was always trying to buy her favor. But he started to say that he had never tried, but the girl interrupted him. calling him by name. Walking past him and forcing him to turn his head to her, she said that she had not come here to get married. Ian caught the girl's hand, asking if she needed time to think and what was going on. Pulling her arm out, she shouted that she did not want to sell herself to her husband because of her father's debt, and that she did not want to step on the same rake. The puzzled boy looked down, asking what she meant. This proposal was about helping each other, and he didn't want to humiliate her. She made him clench his hands into fists of powerlessness when she said, looking him straight in the eye, that they could not be together. Looking down, Ian asked her to give him at least a reason, because he had a feeling she was taking him for a fool. But the girl looked directly at him, saying that they were destroying each other, and that was the reason. He turned around and walked away, while the girl turned her back on him as well. She thought she shouldn't have come here at all. In her past life, she was sitting with her hands over her face and crying. She was thinking about Corey because it had been raining last night and something had happened to him. But Sebastian, who entered the room, brought Corey with him, barking happily. Sitting down next to the dog, the girl happily stroked it while the dog licked her face. The butler was a little embarrassed to say that the gardener had found the dog. He was wet and dirty, but nothing critical. Hugging the dog, Madeline said it was wonderful and asked where the gardener was, because she had to thank him. Saying that he was only doing his job, Sebastian was nervous, which earned him a surprised look from Madeline. He said that Mr. Nottingham had a cold. She asked why, but she also asked how bad he was feeling. Although she heard that the doctor ordered her to lie down and that she was told not to go upstairs, she stood in front of the door to his room. Realizing that she needed to make sure he was okay and that it was no mere coincidence, she entered the room and immediately noticed the puddle. She stared at his wet coat, which was still dripping with water, and thought it couldn't be. He hadn't taken care of the dog when they'd seen each other outside. She stood there and wondered if Ian had been looking for Corey himself while it was raining, and why he hadn't told her about it, and Sebastian had made up a story about the gardener. He was lying in bed wheezing, feeling visibly ill. Touching her own forehead and Ian's, she realized how high his fever was. Picking up the girl, whom he saw vaguely, he called out to her. The Count thought it was his sister Isabelle, who had died of an accident before the war. He began to cry, asking his sister for forgiveness, because he felt very guilty. Squeezing his hand, Madeline asked him to calm down and said that she was not Isabelle, but his wife. When he heard that it was her, Madeline Nottingham, he squeezed her hand even harder. Ian called her name again, blushing and starting to smile. Sitting by the bed, she noticed a red rose standing alone in a vase. It was the same rose that someone had cut from her bush. Ian was on the battlefield, where they were shouting that they had to retreat. Everyone around him was wounded or dead. Everything was on fire. He stood there with a rifle, having heard that the enemy was advancing and that the soldiers were wounded, but he did not retreat himself, did not order them to retreat. When he woke up, the Count screamed from a nightmare, clutching the sheet in pain. Sitting down on the bed, he put his hand over his face and tried to come back to normal, thinking that it was the same nightmare again. Madeline fell asleep next to him, holding his hand even through his dreams. He wondered what the girl was doing in his bedroom and wondered if she was taking care of him. Ian even smiled, thinking that whatever the reason, he felt much better. Her hand pulled him out of his nightmares and soothed him in his sleep. Looking back at himself when they got married, he realized that the marriage was a necessity, an inferior wife for an inferior count. He used to look at himself in the mirror and think about it. Remembering how I watched her and the dog, I thought she was simple and naive, because the Green Man had no idea about the horrors of war, and he was broken by that war. One day, Ian was going through the paperwork and asked Sebastian if he thought Madeline would be lonely with the dog. And then, when he cut her rose and looked at his wife through the window, the husband thought that she had found her way into his world, and he into hers. Sitting in bed now, he wondered gloomily if he had any right to be with her at all, because he could drag her into his own hell. Madeline raised her head sleepily, looking at her husband and saying that he had already regained consciousness. She took her hand away from him in embarrassment, saying that he had a terrible fever, but he said that he was fine now. Asking how Corey was, the Count mentioned that Madeline had said she wanted to go to the movies. She jumped in surprise, asking why he was talking about it. Turning to the window where her rose stood, the Count said that she could now leave the estate whenever she wanted, and he would not keep her here by force. She asked if he expected her to thank him, but the man calmly replied that he wanted to protect her because the world is very dangerous, and now she can go whenever and wherever she wants. When she asked if the world had suddenly become safer, Ian clutched the sheets until his hand hurt. Without turning to face her, he said that he simply did not want to drown her in his hell as well. Feeling sorry for him, she told him not to say such things. Dangling his feet off the bed, Ian replied that silence would not change the fact that it was true. When he stood up and leaned on his cane to leave, asking her to call Sebastian to him, the girl called Ian. Without turning to him, she told him that he could pick as many roses as he wanted, because it was his garden too. The Earl of Nottingham was visibly surprised, trying not to smile, but a slight smile did appear on his face. He thanked me, thinking that this relationship could be better, and that it could be his last chance. The girl put tea and a table next to the Count, asking how he was feeling. The man replied that he was tolerable. She blushed a little as she thought about how he had become more polite since that day of his illness. Before, he wouldn't have even answered her. Taking a book from the shelf, she asked enthusiastically if it was the first edition of Tamerlane the Great, and the man said that she could borrow it if she wanted. Madeline turned to him in surprise, asking if he really meant that she could take him. But then she started to justify herself, saying that she was borrowing it for a while because she knew it wasn't hers. But he interrupted her and said that it was hers. She was even more surprised when she heard Ian say that everything that was his belonged to her as well. His garden was hers, his office was hers. It was the first time he had ever said that out loud. She blushed and glared at her husband, who asked Sebastian how the fence was going. He said that we had to be prepared in case war came, and he ordered the butler to take care of the fence. Madeline thought about how he was always thinking about the war and tried to think of some way to distract Ian from it. She thought that he probably liked old plays. She smiled as she came up with a plan to distract him. Sebastian said that it was too much, because there was nowhere to organize a screening and so much to prepare. But the girl smiled and said that they could organize a screening in the double chapel. The butler asked if he could arrange a reception as usual, but the girl said, putting her roses in a vase, that she wanted to do it perfectly, because that was the first thing Ian had asked. His eyes bulged in surprise when he heard that this estate needed to be changed. She asked me with a smile if it was time to start changing, because the war was becoming a thing of the past with each passing day. For the estate, for Ian, and for her. The butler bowed, apologizing for not immediately being able to understand the deep message she was trying to convey. While she was thanking Sebastian for his continued support, one of the servants called out to him, drawing his attention. He asked where to put the trophy, and Sebastian told him to leave it in his room, and the girl said she would return it right after the party. The girl looked at Ian with a smile as he walked upstairs, wondering if everything would really be okay. Madeline stood with a list of things while the men unloaded them and carried them to where they were needed. But as she helped with the housework, she thought only that with all the life in the estate, she was beginning to feel alive as well. The girl looked out the window and saw Ian and Sebastian, and she realized that the Count was showing respect by not interfering with everything she did. But she wanted to dispel all doubts, so now she stood in front of the door to the Count's chamber and knocked timidly. Upon entering after being authorized, the girl asked if he was still working, but Ian said that it was also a kind of vacation. Blushing at the admission, Madeline said she was nervous because it was the first time she had invited so many people. She said she didn't want anything to go wrong, but Ian said that she had already done a good job on everything. She happily said that she wanted to organize a movie screening after tea, and asked if the Count had ever watched movies. He said he had only seen one once, at an exhibition in Paris. Touching the man's shoulder, she said that she hoped he would watch the movie with her. The man stared at her, unable to find the words to respond, until Madeline said she was sure he would be interested. It was as if he were seeing her for the first time. But then she walked away and wished him to rest halfway through. Standing at the door, she covered her face with her hands, which was red with confusion. She thought she had finally said it. On the day of the screening, there were a lot of people in the hall. Everyone was standing in groups or pairs and talking. Looking around, the girl was happy, because a lot of people had come, so everyone had received invitations and had not ignored them. Everyone was whispering, and Madeline thought that everyone had come only because they wanted to see the famous haunted mansion. She thought that with so many people, Ian would definitely not show up today. As he descended the stairs, the man introduced himself with a smile. He was Ian Nottingham, the owner of the estate. The Count looked at everyone as they whispered, expressing his hope that they would have a good time and thanking them for their visit. He walked up to Madeline, limping, and apologized for being late. But she put her glass down so it wouldn't get in the way and said he wasn't late. The husband looked at his wife steadily, catching every word and change of mood, while she smiled and said that they were just about to start the movie. But then she looked at Ian, who asked her to go along. It was something completely new to her. Taking her husband's hand, Madeline felt him tremble and asked him if he was okay. She was worried about him and his health and told him that he shouldn't overexert himself. But he turned his head to the girl, saying that it was nothing to worry about and that it must be hard to meet guests alone. As they walked, Ian said that there was no need to worry and that he was still very much looking forward to seeing the movie. The girl asked, blushing a little, if he meant to watch the movie with her. She kept her eyes on the man, wanting it to be true. It was obvious that the Count's ears were reddened with emotion, but he did not answer his wife. He just led her to the hall where everyone was gathered for the screening. While waiting for the screening of a movie called The General, Ian asked his wife what the movie was about, and she only replied that she didn't really know what it was about. Blushing, she corrected herself, saying that he was one of the most famous directors of their time and that she thought people would like it. Ian looked at the people in the audience and said that Madeline did a good job. The girl was laughing noticeably, either at the movie or at the man sitting next to her. She was also watching him closely. He watched the movie attentively, but a slight smile was visible on his lips. Blushing, she thought she should thank Ian for coming, because she thought he would be in his room. Now the evening looked perfect for her. She was so deep in thought that she didn't notice her husband's distress. He was clutching his chest and trembling as the screen began to show the war, the horrors of which were now tormenting him. When she heard the explosion in the room on the screen, she turned to her husband, who was having a panic attack and was shaking. He was lying on the back of another chair, coughing and shaking like a leaf of aspen, when the girl asked for help from someone in the audience. Madeline screamed, calling for help, hoping that Sebastian or one of the servants would hear her, or that one of the guests would be able to help. When everyone left the room, and Ian was still in that state, Madeline turned her head to the sound of a man standing a few steps away, saying he was a doctor. The man said that the Count's symptoms resembled a nervous attack, so he needed rest and relaxation. While the girl was crying and wondering about her husband's behavior, he ordered the servants to take his lordship to the bedroom in a commanding tone. The doctor also told them to put a cloth in his mouth, because the Count might bite his tongue, while the servants dragged Ian by the hand to his room. Madeline apologized to the stranger, asking him again if he was a doctor. After adjusting his glasses, the man replied that he had a doctorate in neuropsychiatry and had worked in a hospital for some time. He presented his business card, saying that his name was Cornell Arlington and that he was the eldest son of Baron Arlington. With tears in her eyes, the girl thanked him for his help, saying that everything was so coincidental. She did not realize that she was welcoming her own death. The girl woke up on the couch where she had fallen asleep, not even lying down, but simply lying down with her legs hanging on the floor. It was on the same day, June 28, 1914. It was on this morning that shots were fired in Sarajevo, and it was on this morning that the war began with a crimson dawn. The man handed her a document, saying that she could live in the townhouse until the end of the month while he looked for a new home for her. But her attention was drawn to a group of military guys, among whom she noticed a familiar face. She no longer listened to the man to whom she had sold their townhouse. Madeline looked down in sadness when she saw Ian in the crowd, who was going to war with the others. At her feet was a newspaper with the headlines that Britain had declared war on Germany. She recalled the huge lines at the train station, the people who were burning with patriotism, the honorary send-offs, and almost every man going to war to defend the country. And those who refused to go were called cowards and pointed fingers, denied a quiet life and rejected by society, constantly being made fun of. She recalled her past life. She was a patriot like everyone else. As she read the newspaper and remembered Ian and his two faces before and after the war, she thought only that in her past life she had not known the price of blind patriotism. Her thoughts about how everything was different now were interrupted by her father, who burst into the room and shouted in a drunken voice that she was a toadstool. Turning to her father, she frowned and asked if he had been drinking again. The man shouted that he had no money left because of his daughter and had to choke on this cheap drink. After all, if she had agreed to marry him, all this would not have happened. My father was sitting on the floor, spilling the rest of the drink, and Madeline was telling him to stop and come to his senses. He froze when he heard that she had sold this house as well, so they had to look for a new place to live. The man shouted that she was used to doing things her way, and that she didn't listen to anyone. So he told her to think that he was no longer her father. He would rather die alone than with her by his side. And then, he kept saying that he would have bought a shack with the money he had invested in her education and upbringing if he had known how it would end, and that he was of no use to her. Realizing that the man who called himself her father had never loved her, the girl closed her eyes and thought that this was the end of it. Her father shouted that now she had no chance to marry, as both of Nottingham's sons had already enlisted, and that she would die in poverty. As long as her father didn't shut up, Madeline thought about her own. If Ian did go to war, didn't that mean that everything would go on as before? She thought that if this was the end, she shouldn't say something to Ian. She was visibly weighing the pros and cons. In her past life, Dr. Arlington treated Ian with shock therapy, strapping him to an electric chair and taking notes while he screamed in pain. The maid asked if it was safe to treat people like this while they watched the session through the peephole. Madame Madeline said it was the latest medicine. She put her hand to the door, and looking at a single point in front of her, told the maid to trust the doctor. She tried her best to believe in her own words. Ian was sleeping, apparently dreaming, while the girl was wiping his forehead with a cloth. She did it gently and slowly, just to make him feel better. After apologizing for waking him up, the girl asked him with pity in her eyes if he was having a hard time. Asking if she was talking about treatment, the man said only that he had to get better. He said that if you can't live like this anymore, you have to make every effort to get better. This made Madeline blush slightly. The girl said that he had a good doctor who was a member of the British Medical Association, and the Count said that the doctor had mentioned that, having cured him, he would use this experience to help others. When the girl started wiping the man's face with a cloth again, he told her not to worry and that he would recover soon. He did not look well, and dark circles were visible under his eyes. Interrupting her, Cornell Arlington entered the room and asked Madame Madeline to come with him, as they needed to talk about her husband. While they were drinking tea in the living room, the man said that her husband was suffering from shell shock and that it was accompanied by even more shock. Cornell said that they are now using special methods to reduce their susceptibility to such shocks. When he said that most war heroes recover after the course of treatment, the girl thanked him, saying it was a joy. But Arlington said there was no need to thank her, because it was his job. Looking directly at the Countess, he said that, as a doctor, he had to ask her for something. He looked serious when he said that Madame should stay away from his illumination for a while. After the stimulus, the patient needs rest, and the Count must come to his senses. Madeline's eyes bugged out, not understanding why she had to stay away from her husband. She thought she could help him, because he felt better around her. And Cornell continued, saying that there should be no doubt in treatment, because it is very similar to cutting out a rotten wound. She was confused, because it was her idea to show the movie that made Ian so sick, and now she is interfering with his treatment. But the doctor said that this was not true, but asked that his words be considered only a recommendation that would maximize the effect of the treatment. He said she would communicate with the Count through him. Instead, while the girl was completely confused, he said that he would report on the Count's progress every week, because the lack of communication with her would help keep Ian's thoughts intact. Ian clenched his teeth painfully, feeling the pain of hell, while the doctor coldly told his illumination to be patient. If he had clenched harder, his teeth would have started to crumble. Arlington told him to endure for his wife's sake and asked if he felt sorry for her. The Count's hands shook when he heard that Madeline would have to crawl out of her skin to take care of his crippled body from the doctor. While the Count was shaking in his chair, the doctor said, turning his back on him, that he should become a worthy husband for her. After taking out a syringe with some liquid, he turned to the patient and said that he first had to learn to live without relying on others, and only then would he be truly cured. The Count looked at the doctor in surprise, not understanding what he was saying. Madeline and Corey woke up in the middle of the night, hearing a scream that echoed throughout the estate. Thinking back on it, she now thought the treatment was only that. Thinking back to her then, she reflected that she believed in Arlington so much that she considered even cries of pain to be signs of improvement. She was standing in his room one day with the curtains closed, while Ian sat at the table by candlelight. She thought that the number of Ian's seizures had decreased significantly, but he became even more gloomy than before. While he was writing something, not paying any attention to her, she asked Ian with a smile if they could open the curtains, because the sun was so beautiful that day. But he said that there was no need for that, and even vice versa. She had to leave, because she was only bothering him. When she asked if he was feeling well, the man replied that he was, without even looking up from his papers or looking at his wife. She said with a smile, however, that she was glad to hear that, because he was getting better. Madeline began to talk about a book that interested her, but the Count said rather abruptly that he seemed to be asking her to leave. She was surprised by this behavior. He looked at his wife with a frown and anger, saying that he hoped she would no longer keep him busy during working hours. Sitting at tea with the doctor, she asked if the Count was definitely on the mend, and Arlington looked at her in surprise and a little irritated. When the doctor handed her a book that was supposed to help her understand his illumination's condition, Madeline frowned at the doctor. Cornell said that he hoped she would be interested in this topic and gave her the book Horizons of Neuropsychiatry, as it would be very useful to her looking back at her husband's condition. He said, looking at the girl, that he thought she would make a great nurse. Something about the way he looked was repulsive, even though he tried to smile. Recalling what he saw, Arlington said she followed all the doctor's instructions and took very good care of her husband. With a smile, he said that she was very talented and he would like to have her as his assistant. When he said that he thought nothing could help the Count, she started screaming that he was saying such things. And then she screamed that she had trusted him, and now he was saying this. But he said with a smile that he meant that the situation would not improve in the way she wanted it to. She was surprised to hear that the Count would not have seizures, but he asked her if she was tired of him. That's why he invited her to go on a trip with him and learn to be a nurse. At the same time, the bird spotted a caterpillar, which it caught and held tightly in its beak. This is exactly what was happening to Madeline now. She was caught in his metaphorical beak by Cornell Arlington. When she heard about revenge against the man who had imprisoned her, she wondered if she really wanted to be an obedient wife, as the doctor called her. And he continued, saying that he would allow her to study wherever she wanted and asked if she would come with him. A maid was listening through a crack in the doorway, and she put her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. She was frightened and surprised by what she heard. The maid who stood at the door told her colleagues what she had heard, and they said that the doctor was an insidious infection if he asked their madam to leave. Both girls were surprised to hear that the Countess did not answer. They began to badmouth Madeline, because without the Count she would have been nothing, and he had even given her a puppy to keep her happy. Around the corner in the corridor, there was someone who had been listening to the entire conversation and was in no hurry to make his presence known. They recalled how the lady ran away 2 years ago, saying that she could have met a doctor then, but they had a plan from the beginning. While the girls discussed their guesses, Ian Nottingham listened quietly, standing so that he could hear whatever else the gossips had to say. With his eyes bulging with emotion and confusion, the Count did not even feel his hand shaking as it gripped the stick. He took it all as truth, not realizing that it was just gossip. Sitting in front of the fireplace in the room, he took out a bottle of alcohol and was now gradually destroying its contents. The only sound in the room was the crackle of wood burning in the fireplace. He wondered if she really wanted to leave him, because he had done so much more as her husband. Ian remembered everything that had happened during their marriage. Hiding his face in his hands, he thought he wanted to be closer to her and wondered if all her smiles were fake. He ordered himself to remember, to figure out when she warmed up to him, even though her face had been stony every time they had seen each other before. And he remembered, when he saved the dog. He asked her why she came, even though he had told Sebastian not to let anyone in, what she was thinking while she was nursing him. Was she hoping that he would die, and that's why she called a doctor? Recalling his seizure during the movie, Ian thought that she knew exactly what the plot was then, and that she was staging it to affect the Count. She also invited people to see the play. He thought that she was constantly coming to watch him being tortured, and was waiting for the right moment to escape from a monster like him. He didn't hear the knock on the door because he was looking at his hands, which were shaking, and sweat was rolling down his face. Looking into the room, the girl said it was her and asked if she could come in. Coming closer, Madeline asked if he could drink, as she saw a glass and a bottle. She reminded him that Dr. Arlington had asked him to abstain from alcohol. Clenching his hands into fists and looking at her with anger, he would say that she was talking about him again, and ask if she had decided to become a doctor as well. And if they were close, she would definitely become one, he said. The girl trembled as she opened her mouth at what he said. She assured him that nothing of the sort had happened and that she was only taking care of him. He abruptly jumped off the girl, shouting that he was the owner of this house and that no one had the right to order him. Madeline tried to justify herself by saying that she didn't mean it at all. She said that it was the final stage of treatment, and the sooner it was over, the sooner the doctor would leave. But he imagined another Madeline, whispering nastily that she was with him. All he saw were his own fantasies, where Madeline called him a monster and said she didn't want to be with someone like him anymore, and that she was disgusted to be around him. The imaginary girl took his face and said that even his pennies would not make her stay by his side, and it was high time he realized that things were not that simple. But the real Madeline tried to pull him out of her fantasies, calling his name several times. She did not understand what was happening. While the imaginary one was asking how he had the brains to think that she would be with him, the real one touched his face and tried to bring him to his senses, asking if he was okay. When he heard that he was a nobody, even though it was his own invention, he threw his wife's hand away. All he could hear was the voice of the fictional Madeline. She did not understand what was happening when she asked him, but he ordered her to return to her room immediately. Her eyes widened at what she heard, because Ian said she should behave accordingly, since she had been sold to him. She could not believe what he had said. Looking at her with a crazy look and staring into her confused eyes, the Count said that without him, she would have been on the street long ago. He unceremoniously pushed the girl away, saying that if she had heard everything she wanted to hear, she could go back to her room and live a quiet life, as befits a Count's wife. Ian looked at the girl with disdain, frowning and even taking his hand away from her as if she were a leper. But fuck him. He walked around Madeline and went to the door, leaving her alone. She stood there alone, staring at one point, trembling. She didn't understand what was happening, why their relationship had become like this, and what she had done to him to make him say such things.